My name is Bob Casey. My name is Bob Casey. My name is Bob Casey, and this is To Tell the Truth. Down goes the curtain, and back up goes the curtain for the Bob Casey Show. Foolishness aside, I am, after all, dealing with the city of Pittsburgh. And the crowd who covered for the AIDS attack by making out their activities towards me as being some kind of national lampoon. And this, of course, included the Peter Gabriel Show. If you look at Allegheny General Hospital, you see they have a sign that's choreographed graphically, James St. Garage. And clearly, the Veterans Administration over there at the hospital, times past, knew that they had held me in a garage on Snively, forcing me to use inhalants while on a profoundly powerful hallucinogen, as they talked to me in tongues and made psychotic homosexual advances on me. As a hostage child who was battered beyond all remorse from the Pope Leo establishment in the Ghettoburg of Eastminster District. There are other things that are very indicative of Pittsburgh Catholic game planning in this nightmare, such as the fact that Western Psychiatric is on O'Hara Street, which is like Scarlett O'Hara. Now, the No Hope Pope, Leo, got up on his podium this morning and said that violence and vulgarity are the cause of our strife. Well, you know, O'Hara was Scarlett O'Hara, Crimson O'Hara, was the woman in Gone with the Wind who broke the vulgarity line when Cary Grant or whoever it was said, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. It's the first time that word got past the censors. Basically, the media system loyal to the idea that Paul McCartney's operation, which amounts to a detention switchboard of constant probing and an allegation and questioning of someone who, after all, was deaf in a Pittsburgh public school, who they detected had some kind of what they call weird intelligence, because I was exposed to Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Seventh Circle, read Dante's Divine Comedy, and was subject to horrors as a hostage child in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So they call it special education of a provincial norm. Sort of like bombing Gaza is a provincial norm too, to them. So where does vulgarity enter our society? Well, I had grandparents who were distinguished citizens of Poplar Bluff, Missouri, who wouldn't allow, it was just understood that you never cursed around them. Their dignity was so unquestionable that as a child, I felt blameworthy for even knowing the words that Ian Wattenmaker had taught me in the presence. The Midwest has an evil reputation in the East End of Pittsburgh for being prudes. Zappa liked to attack them. I was a little bit surprised when my grandmother gave me The Rookies to read after she read it because of the way that the San Francisco Cubs played fast and loose with vulgarity in that book. Just as I was surprised that Rabelais was so ribald, or Geoffrey Chaucer from the medieval era had these images that resembled the storyline with Leslie Katz. But Carnegie Mellon in Seattle engineered the SmackDown switchboard that just keeps firing allegations at me, burn baby burn style, for Yoko Ono. It's not the sort of thing that you would expect Amnesty International to do, to take the word of murderers, known murderers who tortured children over one of their victims. But they have victim smackdown going. They have starlets from the Neva Corporation who engineered this idea that when the show was over, they would pass the collection plates from the pornographic genocide, pay-per-view of the atrocities in Gaza and so on. So Pope Leo's take on the subject evidently is, if I'm not going to go along with Paul McCartney's game plan, I'm going to have to fight literally everyone. And he goes out to the bars, talk to, do you hate Jimmy Carrey? Tell us why, and fires it at me through the media. And they had nicknames for me like Lapper. What does Lapper mean? There's a stripe on John Lennon's chin and How I Won the War. Chinny Chin Chin, Chinny, who taught me sign language, lived right down the road from Leslie Katz. Huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in, not by the hair on my chinny chin chin. And Greg Cole writes, the listener is led through a bewildering myriad of surface details to arrive at the fundamental themes. It's a Fonzie scheme. And they have ever biased sandbagger Owen Jones making pitches for Kyra Schoen and the Zombie Troupe. You know, I was told, man, the hardcore Gleaner's attorney from Mount Desert Island, justifying Will Zell, who was speaking about AIDS before it happened. They're like, you were womanizing. That's the thing that comes through in Carol O'Connor's episode about AIDS in the heat of the night. This guy just going around sleeping with women, unconcerned that he has AIDS. And a man Bowie started it. She was covering for the Circle from the Society for Human Ecology and Jackson Immunogenetic Laboratories up on the island where Carlton Putnam wrote Race and Reason. Mount Desert Island, right? It's absurd theater. It's guerrilla theater. And they're justifying it. Oh, when they're caught, they start handing out bread and jam just like any powwow. It's team genocide. Tanya, who is on the same team as Sherman Alexie in Seattle. They just cover for it in different ways. And they want to make me the show, you're the show, off we go. And they say I slept with Dee Dee. Dee Dee was an experienced, blossoming hooligan from this crowd, put up by the Italian fascists, working with Neva Corporation. And Dee Dee Allen, it's the first credit, one of the first credits in Serpico. The people who made the film shot him in the face. And they're making peep of me after using a neuroplasm on me. They don't believe in corrupting the morals of the minors because they're promoting the movie Kids, which is a disturbing movie. But they slaughtered me. Slaughtering blows to the head. They gave an implant, an Elon Musk type of strategy, making neuroobedience. would taser me from the inside if I didn't do what they said, if I wasn't yes master to them. And they made it out that they were just hurting me. 21-year-old, 18-year-old take out a 13-year-old and put them on inhalants after using their sister as bait. Why did they shoot Malala in the face? Why did they shoot Serpico in the face? Why did they shoot Jimmy Carrey in the face? It's because these correction officers don't like what class? Erotic art from Japan. Everybody knows what a facial is who looks at erotic art from Japan. It's nothing I've ever engaged in reality. And of course, it's two versions, pussy balls. So they have O'Hara Street. Western Psychiatric is at O'Hara Street. It's a Western, right? Chivalric code, draw, buddy. And Pope Leo underwrites it by saying that Mary is the princess of peace. In other words, if you're a virgin, you can have peace. Otherwise, it's war. And these people never grow up. They never even consider the possibility of growing up. They encrypt everything. And it's institutional politics. The parochials who married into my family worked for Fox Media. They didn't even have to look at the letters to know what they said. Peter Gabriel was already with the album So. And his attorney contacts me and says the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Migliosi told me a joke that said patience, jackass, patience for too long. And when you say, would you hurry up with the punchline, he says, patience, jackass, patience. Well, when you tell that joke to somebody who knows, they just wait and the joke's on you. And they change the spelling from patience, C-E, to patience, T-S. These are George Romero people. Patience, Jack. And more patience, Jack. More patience, Jack. That's the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Was the alternative switchboard that allowed the horses to be scared into running to the burning barn. That's exactly what happened. Well, I was trying to warn people, back off and get your safety first. Figure out what's going on. These people are under attack. They were saying, don't attack us, it's stigma. And they sieged under the bathhouse. They said, we refuse to close the bathhouses because you're not treating us respectfully. And the lawyers were saying the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I was trying to warn them. But when you say that, sweep that as water under the bridge. David Bowie comes with Ronald Reagan and says, we have the plan. And they pretend it was an intercept. Because they get away with pretending with an intercept, they can then pretend that it's adoption. And they start firing people maniacally dressed to look like vampires. They say, you were womanizing, you should throw your hard-earned labors and injury claims into the collective sock of the people who designed this Fonzie scheme. And all of the sandbaggers covered for it. The question of whether Pope snuggling Herzog, Pope Leo snuggling Herzog, will be looked at in the way that the popes of Vichy era Nazi Germany are looked at depends a lot on sandbagger cover stories for Gail Burston and Peter Gabriel. And that's very simply the truth. So, when you look at the man who poisoned me in the face, Tony Servey, he called school prison. And Pink Floyd likes that kind of guy, and he really liked Pink Floyd. So these people out with their nerve agents and their LSD therapy and their masturbators in a sock imagery of liberals have used nerve agents on public school children who they kidnapped and tortured, and they call it a rescue job from the prison of schools. They don't like liberal education. And they refuse to talk to children about the difficulties of marriage and the biology and medical aspects of sexual intercourse. They put out hair. Was that respectable? Gonorrhea can be fun. They didn't sing that, no. They set up the clinics instead as a Venus flytrap, and I'm not supposed to investigate.
by investigating, I became one of them. And you're not one of us.
And they even put out a song called Not One of Us. It's like the idea of the blessed union of the deceived. The blessed union of the deceived refuses to allow anyone to question them. You will not cross us. We are the blessed union of the deceived. Dawes once said that he approved of the apartheid people because they said, well, when you challenged the black people were in Africa first, he said, well, we developed it, which of course is a rationalization for the structure he represents, which is the apartheid Israel. There's a lot of material like this in my books, but when they're crying over computer corruption, for example, and saying that's vulgarity and that's sin, you need to understand that these were filmmakers from Carnegie Mellon University who tortured a child and talked openly of impinging on the persona's experience. So when you get soundtrack like, yeah, sure, tied her up and porked her with a carrot, they even knew who that was impinged by, and it had nothing to do with me. But they go into the seventh circle, Solzhenitsyn and Dante's Inferno, and start dragging what was a high school valedictorian class from the governor's school through the muck and mire of the alleyways of Eastminster, child pornography, trafficking circuits. One of the nicer things they did, they laughed about, was dragging me through glass. And you're supposed to believe the Pope Leo stands for the protection of children. He just wants to promote the Pope blackout on the campaign to justify the AIDS attack as defense of virginity. Now, the attack on my grandparents, they wouldn't dare attack my grandparents, but they have the Ferguson lad who says that Jimmy talked about his sister partying with Ralph Karsh, who was with the Todd family, Milton Schaap, Watton Maker, who gave me the nerve agent through a gang that tortured me, forced me to take it. And they were older than me. They were partying in my house. And the Ferguson lad says, well, see, he's the devil. He's not Warden Murray. He's an evil spawn from liberalism. And they say John Lennon was the original truth of this. And this is like a copycat. And they set up their fabrication that John Lennon would approve of the torture of his following. And they set up their switchboard about, are you or aren't you truly a John Lennon advocate? Well, I was never a John Lennon advocate. That infuriates them. I didn't like him all that much. I was more into other bands. But I liked him enough that they all knew that I would never do anything like that. So they have this shadow phenomenon of existential psychology to make the victims tear at a dummy doll. It turns out I'm alive. I'm not a dummy doll at all. Turns out I was trying to help them, but they get the turnaround signal going with Brian Eno in his spinner beanie on his doghouse, fighting it out with the Red Baron. And they prefer that to an actual investigation. Mon Bowie in the Heat of the Night was basically endorsing the idea that David Bowie deserved to die because he was a womanizer, unleashing the movie Kids as reckless abandon in this Holocaustal Epstein Night of the Living Dead, without saying that, because she was targeting the white double who had a fantasy of being like John Lennon. What do they want to talk to me about? They should back off. They should stop heckling and abusing somebody who meant well by them. It's demeaning of the circumstances I find myself in. These people would not dare attack Warden Marie Moore. They were distinguished citizens of Poplar Bluff, Missouri. So what did they do instead? They send up a Wichita figure skating team into Bobby Kennedy's mind blender. And that exercises the demons of Yusuf Endor, who lives to bring fear and terror to American liberalism. It's his whole hymn, as Steve Heinemann would say. And they refuse to look at the evidence. They refuse, the ninnies, like Claire Daly is a ninny. Francesca Albanese is a ninny. Greta Thunberg is a ninny. The ninnies in Paul McCartney's entourage refused to admit that they had a nerve agent that they were using to suffocate me psychologically when I was a so-called undesirable, jealous guy being rejected by a girl who was, after all, ventilating therapeutically the severe neurotoxic injury in my facial nerve. Refused to admit that Pope Carl talked about impinging on the persona's experience. Refused to admit that Skank from Pennsylvania introduced the word extrusion. Refused to admit that Carbonell was working with Swimmer and Visco in natural language systems with Brian Milnes from the Zionist laboratories who produced John Schulman over on Celeron Road. Refused to admit that I wasn't the driver of Kelly School. Refused to admit that they withheld my education to make this counterfeit switchboard detention operation sail because they didn't want anybody to believe a single word I said. They refused to admit that I hid in the towel closet. They just say, don't say like Anne Frank. They refuse to admit that I forced my mother to move to a new neighborhood, that this escape behavior shows that I was being subject to servitude by traffickers who were intoxicating me, beating me, and tricking me constantly because they were Ivy League professionals from Hollywood. They refused to admit that Swami Nostra was a semiotic system, not medicine man, not Reagan being Chief Joseph. They were Wyspansky's fourth dimensional psychology and semiotic communications media. Refused to admit that I had legitimate grounds to put myself at risk investigating to protect my peers. They refuse to admit any of it because they are responsible for allowing it to happen. It's not water under the bridge, Mr. McCartney. It's you are an executive war criminal.